for the post-World War background reading. U.S. foreign policy. The Truman Doctrine came to be one of the first acts put in place by the United States to help counter the forces of communism. In Greece, communism was growing and revolutions were starting due to the British trying to disarm Greece. President Truman, who believed the Soviet Union was behind all communist ideas and governments, requested aid to the governments of Greece and Turkey. On March 12, 1947, Congress approved for $400 million to be sent to the region to help free people resist communist expansion, a deal known as the Truman Doctrine. The U.S. was trying to combat the spread of communism in Western Europe as well. The idea of communism sounded great to Europeans who had lost everything during the war. The Marshall Plan called for economic assistance to rebuild Europe after the war. $12 billion was eventually dumped into Europe's economy and assisted in rebuilding their infrastructure and restoring their financial capacity. The primary way the U.S. tried to slow down the growth of communism was containment. The U.S. implemented laws and bills to try and contain communism to the Soviet Union. Their attempt to slow communism was based on the fact that the USSR considered itself as the chief opponent to U.S. imperialism. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was an alliance for military assistance and mutual defense against the Soviet Union. The many nations that joined NATO formed a bloc, or group of countries united for a common purpose. This is known as the Western Bloc. The Eastern Bloc consisted of the Soviet Union and his allies. The USSR foreign policy. As a response to the formation of NATO, which West Germany decided to join, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact was a military and political alliance of its own that consisted of the communist nations in Eastern Europe. The USSR regarded the pact as a vital defense against the Western Europe and newly joined Germany. In Germany, the Soviet Union cut all ground transportation into West Berlin. They believed they would starve the Western allies, who controlled the other parts of the divided Germany, out of the nation, thus removing them from Soviet territory. An Iron Curtain was created that divided Europe. Behind the Iron Curtain were Eastern European countries that were under Soviet control and communism. This was the defining line of the Cold War. In 1948, Czechoslovakian government was toppled and replaced with an all-communist government, and in 1949, Hungary also came under communist control. In communism in Asia, in 1949, the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, defeated the existing nationalist government of China and founded the People's Republic of China. The U.S. refused to recognize the People's Republic as they spread communism in China and other parts of Asia. In 1950, the communist leader of North Korea invaded South Korea. The Chinese helped North Korea, while the United Nations forces, led by the U.S., helped the South Korea. Communism was then spread into Vietnam. Communism was then fully spread into Korea, where it influenced North Vietnam to become a communist government. Communism was then attempting to spread into South Vietnam, and the U.S. supported South Vietnam in an attempt to stop the spread of communism. China and the USSR supported North Vietnam, and that conflict became known as the Vietnam War. And then the Indochina War. The United States supported France during the First Indochina War because Ho Chi Minh was a communist. Many U.S. military and officials liked and respected Ho, but the United States wanted to stand firm in their promise of containing Soviet and communist expansion. Ho Chi Minh believed the U.S. would assist them because the Viet Minh, which he led, had assisted the U.S. military in fighting Japan during World War II. Sorry about that. The Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict was caused by a disagreement between the newly formed nation of Israel and their Arab neighbors in Palestine and other nations. The British withdrew from the region in 1948, which left the Jewish people in Jerusalem and the Palestinian Arabs to fight for their land. When the British officially withdrew all their troops on May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the founding of Israel in the area of the Jewish settlement in Palestine. The surrounding Arabs did not recognize Israel as a nation and believed the Arabs in Israel had the right to self-determination. Forces from Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, and Transjordan invaded Israel and started the First Arab-Israel War. This conflict was part of the Cold War because both the United States and Soviet Union assisted nations during this conflict. The United Nations could have helped settle an agreement or treaty between the Jewish and Arabs before Israel was declared a nation. This could have prevented any conflict if talks were had to keep peace in the Middle East. And in Cuba and Afghanistan, in 1952, Fulgencio Batista achieved power in Cuba by taking over the government. He was backed by the United States, even though he illegally achieved the power and used his power to run a dictatorship in Cuba. He used his power to protect wealthy Cuban and American landowners in Cuba who ran Cuba's sugar industry. Fidel Castro was a lawyer who tried to challenge Batista's illegal taking of power. Unfortunately, it did not work, so Castro organized groups of Cuba's working class to start a revolution against Batista on July 26, 1953. Castro failed, and 2 years later, after he was released from prison, he tried again and led the rebels to take over the capital. Castro showed increasingly communist ideas, and in 1961, the U.S. tried to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs, which ended in an embarrassing surrender for the U.S. In 1962, the Soviet Union sent nuclear missiles to Cuba, and the United States found them pointed at us. The U.S. formed a blockade around Cuba, and the Cuban Missile Crisis worried citizens for up to 10 days. Many events occurred that could have started a nuclear war, but the U.S. and Cuba agreed to remove their nuclear missiles to avoid a conflict. The U.S. removed their missiles in Turkey, while Cuba removed their missiles from the Soviet Union. In Afghanistan, a communist group had helped push a new leader into the position of power. After he learned that he was losing power and support, he requested help from the United States to fight against the Soviet forces that had been invading the country. The United States supported Pakistan and other nations to fight a war in Afghanistan against the Soviets, who eventually withdrew in 1989. Protests. In 1980, shipyard workers sent on strike in Poland and formed a trade union. Nearly one-third of Poland's population joined to protest communism and the shortages of foods and goods that was occurring. This led to the Soviet Union reforming because they could not compete with the U.S.'s military or provide for their citizens. In China, university students had started protests against the Chinese Communist Party. They assembled in Tiananmen Square and took to the streets to call for democratic reform, an end to government censorship and corruption, greater rights to protest, and more money for education. Eventually, the Chinese government brought in tanks and troops, where thousands of people were killed to control the protests. The government announced the aggression was necessary because the students were supposedly trying to overthrow the government. And in the end, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc collapsed. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was falling apart. The borders were becoming less serious, Germany had become unified again, and people were standing up to their governments. The Soviet Union was losing the control it once had. In 1991, a reform was taking place, and Soviet officials could not decide on who should take leadership or what new ideas should be imposed. In December 1991, the presidents of Ukraine and Belarus voted to dissolve the Soviet Union, ending the Cold War. The Eastern Bloc dissolved with the Soviet Union, and so did Yugoslavia. The many people of Yugoslavia broke out into separate nations wanting their own freedoms. Thank you.